This is part 24 of Angular 2 tutorial. In this video, we'll discuss Angular component lifecycle hooks. A component has a lifecycle managed by Angular. Anytime a component is required, Angular creates the component, renders the component, creates and renders the component children, checks when the component data-bound properties change, and finally destroys the component before removing it from the DOM. So to tap into and react when these events occur, Angular offers several lifecycle hooks, as you can see right here. The order in which these lifecycle hooks are specified is the order in which they execute. As you can see, there are a lot of them. Out of all these hooks, the three most commonly used ones are ng-on-changes, ng-on-init, and ng-on-destroy. So let's look at these three commonly used lifecycle hooks. ng-on-changes. This is called before ng-on-init. This lifecycle hook executes every time the value of an input property changes. The hook method receives a simple changes object containing current and previous property values. We'll look at an example of using this in just a bit. ng-on-init. This lifecycle hook executes after the constructor and after ng-on-change hook for the first time. It's most commonly used for component initialization and retrieving data from a database. We'll look at an example of using this in our next video. ng-on-destroy executes just before Angular destroys the component and generally used for performing cleanup. Now let's look at a simple example of using ng-on-changes lifecycle hook. So here is what we want to do. On a web page, we want to have a text box, and as we type into this text box, we want to capture the current and previous value and log it to the browser console, as you can see right here. So let's see how to achieve this using ng-on-changes lifecycle hook. This is the same project that we have been working with so far in this video series. Now we know ng-on-changes is called every time the component input property changes. So let's create a simple component with one input property. We're going to place this simple component in a different folder. So let's right click on our app folder and add a new folder, and let's name our folder others, and let's right click on this new folder and add a new TypeScript file, and I'm going to name our component simple.component.ts. Let's click OK. First, let's create our class. Export class and then the name of our class. Let's name our class simple component. Next, let's import the component decorator from Angular core. To turn this class into a component, let's decorate it with component decorator. First, let's specify a selector for our component. Let's set the selector as simple, so we can use the selector anywhere we want to use this component. And this component is going to have one input property. Let's name our input property simple input. We can give it any meaningful name we want. I just called it simple input, and the data type for this is going to be string. And to turn this property into an input property, we need to decorate it with input decorator. So first, let's import input decorator from Angular core and decorate this property with @input decorator. Next, let's include an inline template for our component. Look at what the inline template does. It displays this text you entered and whatever value we have within this input property, simple input. And here is what we want to be able to do. So whatever value we type in this text box, we want to echo that on the web page like this. And the way we are going to achieve this is by including this text box within our root component, that is our app component. And whatever we type into this text box, we pass that value to this input property of our component. And this input property is then used with interpolation to display the value we have typed into this text box. So our next step is to include a text box within our root component, which is app.component.ts. So within the inline template right here, let's include a text box. To keep track of what we have typed into this text box, let's include a property within our class. I'm going to name this property user text and the data type is string. And now let's use two-way data binding to keep the value within this property and in the text box in sync. And to use two-way data binding, we use ng-model directive. ng-model equals our property name, which is user text. Next, let's nest our simple component within this root component. Before that, let's use two HTML break elements. And for our simple component that we have just created, the selector that we have used is simple. So let's use this selector as a directive within our root component where we want to nest it. And the simple component also has an input property, and the name of the input property is simple input. So let's bind to this input property. So within a pair of square brackets, we specify the name of the input property of the simple component, and we want to bind it to this property of our root component. And let's close the simple directive. There are several moving parts here, so let's understand what's going on. Now, if you look at the text box, we are using two-way data binding with this, and we have bound this text box to this property user text. So whatever value we type into the text box, that value is also updated in this property user text. We are then binding this user text property to the input property of our simple component. So that value gets passed to the input property. And what are we doing with that input property of the simple component? So if we look at that within our simple component, we are simply echoing that on the web page using interpolation. So whatever we type into the text box, that gets displayed on the web page, as you can see right here. Before we can run our project, we need to import and register our simple component within the root module. So let's open this file app.module.ts, which contains our root module. First, let's import our simple component, and then let's declare that within the declarations array. Let's save our changes and view the page in the browser. Notice at the moment whatever we have in the text box is echoed on the web page. Now what we want to be able to do is the value that we type into the text box, we want to capture the current and previous values and log those values into the console window. At the moment we don't have anything within the console, so as we type into this text box, we want to capture the current and previous values and log it to the console. Let's see how to achieve this using ng-onChanges lifecycle hook. The first step to use a lifecycle hook is to import the interface that contains the lifecycle hook method. In our case, we want to use ng-onChanges lifecycle hook. Now the interface for this is onChanges, and we will have to import that interface from Angular core first. So let's do that now. So within our simple component, along with component and input, we also want to import onChanges lifecycle hook interface. Now if you look at this ng-onChanges lifecycle hook method, this also receives an object called simple changes as a parameter. So let's also import simple changes from Angular core. Next, we make this class implement this lifecycle hook interface onChanges. So let's use the implements keyword for that, and then we want to implement onChanges interface. And then finally we provide implementation for this method ng-onChanges. Notice we have a red squiggly here, and if we look at the error, it says class simple component incorrectly implements interface onChanges. Property ng-onChanges is missing in type simple component. So basically it's complaining that we are incorrectly implementing this interface onChanges because it contains a method called ng-onChanges, which is our lifecycle hook method, which is missing implementation. So let's provide implementation for ng-onChanges lifecycle hook method. So within our class, let's include the name of the method ng-onChanges, and we know this method is called every time the value of this input property changes, and this method is going to receive a change object. Let's call the object changes, and the type for this is simple changes which we have imported from Angular core, and this object is going to contain all the property names that have changed, current and previous values. So let's provide the implementation for this method. Now all we are going to do within this method is loop through all the properties that we have in the changes object that we are going to receive into this method, and then we are going to get the property name, so we're going to store that in this variable, and we are going to get the current value of that property as well as the previous value using current value and previous value properties respectively. And then we're using string concatenation here to display the property name that has changed, its current value and previous value. Pretty straightforward code here, and we are using let keyword instead of var keyword to declare our variables. So let's save all our changes and reload our web page. Notice now within the console we have the property name, its current value and previous value. Look at what's going to happen as we type into the text box. Notice the property name, its current value and previous value are automatically logged to the console. So we know every time a value in this text box changes, it also changes the input property of our nested component. When the input property of the nested component changes, it automatically calls this ng-onChanges lifecycle hook method, passing it this simple changes object which contain the names of the properties, their current value and previous values. And all we are doing within this hook method is logging the properties, their current and previous values to the console, and we see those values right here. Now instead of using string concatenation like this, we can also use this placeholder syntax. Notice within the placeholder we have specified a variable. The value we have in this variable will then be concatenated to this string right here. So whichever syntax you prefer, you are free to use that syntax. So here are the 3 simple steps to use a lifecycle hook. First, import the lifecycle hook interface. Next, make the component class implement the lifecycle hook interface using the implements keyword. And finally, provide the implementation code for the lifecycle hook interface method. In this video, we've looked at an example of ng-changes lifecycle hook. In a later video, we'll look at an example of ng-onInit lifecycle hook. One important thing to keep in mind is that this second step right here is optional. So even if we remove this line right here, implements on changes, this is going to work exactly the same way as before. Let's actually prove it. Let's save our changes and reload our web page. Notice now as we start to type, it works exactly the same way as before. So the obvious question that comes to our mind at this point is then what's the use of this line? Now if we include this line, then TypeScript knows that our intention is to implement onChanges lifecycle hook interface. So if we make any typographical errors like this, TypeScript compiler will be able to flag that as an error right away at compile time, as you can see right here. But if we don't have this line right here, then TypeScript compiler does not know our intention, whether we want to implement onChanges lifecycle hook or whether we want to implement a separate method with name onChanges. So it will not be able to flag this as an error. So I suggest, though this step is optional, always include it when implementing a lifecycle hook. Thank you for listening and have a great day.